So you left your guild, Mike. Does this mean you're going to do what Finn's done and re-roll your main class? Perhaps the Hunter is just overpowered and now it's going to sink down into the depths. Those are actually really good questions, and for the many of you who think that the new tier is exactly the time to re-roll, you're looking for the answers to which way should you go. So we're going to try and help you out with that today. So let's get into this, shall we? And we're going to be talking about some stuff that might seem complicated, but actually it's really not. And I do want to point out here that historically I've had some altercations with the guys who are heavy into Simcraft, mainly the guys who produce it. Now, that's always been the vast minority of those guys. At least all the ones I've spoken to and met IRL understand that there is a line where Simcraft becomes less useful and reality starts to play a role. Now, since the beginning of time, all the way back to the Elitist Jerks forums during Vanilla, there have been a subset of players who live vicariously through Simcraft. They're extremely good mathematically, and they believe that it is the straightest and true arrow that you can find is the mathematical results of what should come out of World of Warcraft. And then there have been those guys who said, yeah, that's really, really good. Don't get us wrong, that's absolutely amazing. But when it comes to practicality and implementation, it's not always the correct answer. However, we still rely on it massively in order to find out what is our best talent setups, what is the way we want to go. But every now and again, we might need to switch that up, even though technically and mathematically that might seem to be the lowest thing. Now, the reason I bring that up is Simcraft does provide a list of what is currently the best. And combined that with my guild dying, Finn re-rolling to join his new guild, and people asking me, well, when you came into the Shadowlands, you weren't exactly ecstatic about the Hunter. You wanted it for X, Y, and Z reason. Now that the tier's over, are you looking to change? Because there are also quite a lot of people, and I want to really address this. This isn't a video about Flavor of the Month re-rolling. It's more about where the dangers are of people who think that way. We do know that a reasonable quantity of you do Flavor of the Month re-roll, at least in the player base itself, maybe not who listens to me. But where can we look for information on what might be the best thing? So first of all, we have not got the 9.1 PTR yet, or the 9.1 announcements. Likely we'll see a lot of stuff at BlizzCon Online, which is coming at the end of the month. Looking forward to that very much. But Blizzard have stated they're no longer going to be making major changes in between major patches. So the 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 patches are the major patches. They do have the 0.15s, etc. Those are the more minor patches. But when it comes to something along the lines of completely reworking how a Covenant ability works, because as we've seen, statistically, the most powerful Covenant ability is where most people are, regardless of thematic choice or anything along those lines. Wherever that is, that's where the players are, and the people outside of that are in the vast minority. So, a lot of people will be in that boat where they would prefer to be a different Covenant or have interchangeable ones. But Blizzard have said, we're not going to make major changes to that. What we don't really want is people feeling like they need to re-roll their Covenant in the middle of a tier. We don't want that to happen. Similarly, what we don't want to do is majorly crush and buff specs in the middle of a tier. We don't really want to do that either, because people get their characters set up. They put effort into them. They're grinding them all. They're grinding the renown. And if we suddenly crush their class in the middle of a tier, that's not very fair either. So the big point patches are where we're going to see major changes, which means always take things with a pinch of salt and always wait for that information to come out before you consider changing your spec or anything along those lines. Now, why would people consider changing their spec? Is it just so that they can be Flavor of the Month? Absolutely not. That's a really silly reason. Generally, it might be that in the first tier, they didn't enjoy the spec they chose. That is a very, very big reason that a lot of people find in between tiers a good reason to re-roll. Whatever you came out of the Shadowlands Alpha and Beta thinking was going to be great, whatever felt great at the start of the Shadowlands, whatever that might be, after you've done a tier with that class, you might think, yeah, okay, I don't really enjoy this. And in fact, the grass looks greener on the other side. That's always a good thing. And another side of this, which I think is the most important one, is actually those guys who decided on their favorite class and spec, absolutely loved that favorite class and spec, yet it has not seen any representation in the high-end meta of the game. And as we know, that does trickle down. It trickles down all the way from the very, very high end, all the way down into pugs, where certain classes are favored. There's no argument there. That is regularly something that happens. So going back to what Simcraft posted, Simcraft puts on its front page, and you guys can check this straight away, is what is currently simming as the best. Now, it's a very standard single target sim. It's very easy to read. It's nice and color coded. All those kinds of things. And I've seen, and people have tweeted me endlessly, and then come into, say, a stream or whatever to ask me about this. What do I think about this? Because if you look at that, as it stands right now, it's really interesting. It is very, very, very interesting to see that. Because what you're going to see at the very, very top of that list, which you would think, especially if you're a casual player listening to this, you would think whatever is the very top 10 of that list is absolutely what you should be playing. Because they are going to have by far and away the easiest time of getting into content, right? Even all the way down to the pug. So if you're just trying to pug your +4, if you're playing one of those, you're going to have a much easier time than somebody who's down in the bottom 30. So let's take a little look at that top 10. So right now, at the very, very top, sim-wise, we're seeing the Shadow Priest. We're seeing Frost Mages. We're seeing the Owlweave Feral Druid. So these are the Feral Druids that are actually popping out using Heart of the Wild and doing Convoke the Spirits as a balanced druid and not as a feral druid. Not something we haven't seen before, by the way. There was regularly this issue with Heart of the Wild where feral druids were essentially playing a moonkin for portions of the fight. Then we're seeing balanced druids. Then we're seeing feral druids just played the normal way. Unholy DKs, outlaw rogues. Then we're seeing the fire mage. Then we're seeing frost DKs, arms warriors, windwalkers, and then enhancement shaman. Now you'll notice all of them are above what were considered to be the meta at the start of the tier. Marksmanship hunter, for example, is the sort of middle of the pack to low. Affliction warlocks are in the same sort of boat as that. We're seeing rep paladins down there and all that kind of stuff. And in fact, bottom of the barrel, absolute bottom of the barrel, is a demonology warlock. Now I want you to bear that in mind for a moment. Okay, so that's what they're saying is currently the best. Why then, if you're a casual player, when you look at this, is that not what's reflected identically in what people are actually playing? And this is where that division happens, because it does exist. Like it or not, it does exist. Now, there can be a whole slew of reasons here. People are already very heavily geared into Fire Mage, for example, so they're not playing Frost. Frost only recently got some buffs, so maybe that's the reason. There are all these little things that do play into this. But ultimately, it comes down to practicality and effect, because now we're in farm for the top players, right? So your guild might still be progressing, and that's totally fine. But the top 100 is now done for the mythic Castle Nathria. So what we're in now is farm. And in farm, the top players generally start playing whatever the hell they want. There'll be some players who just stick to whatever they're geared for, because they just farm and get gear for the next tier, and they don't really care enough to mess around. But there are plenty of players out there who use this as a good opportunity to start messing around with different specs. They can afford to do lower DPS because the raid overall is just doing much, much higher damage. So they can afford to be slightly less on the curve, right? It doesn't matter that they're not playing the absolute best of the best of the best all the time. So if we look to a fight that is pretty much a straight up single target fight with no weakened phases, which would be Sludge Fist, if we look to something more like Hungering Destroyer, which basically is single target, but we have a bit of movement, so it's not that bad, what we actually see is an Affliction Warlock, which is middle of the pack and the low on the sim side. What we see is a Fire Mage at number 3, but is sort of, it's like position number 7 or 8 on this list. We're seeing Marksman Hunters. We are seeing Shadow Priests, we are seeing Balanced Druids, and we are seeing Feral Druids. They are up there as well. And we're starting to see, what we're not seeing is a big representation of Frost Mages. In fact, we're not seeing any Frost Mages at all. In fact, an Arcane Mage, I believe, pops up more regularly than a Frost Mage right now. So people are trying out these different specs. And it can be very confusing, right? Because we're even seeing a Demonology Warlock pop up there in these top logs. Whereas, according to the Sims, they're the absolute bottom of the barrel. So these can all be a little confusing for people who are like, well, I really, really love Demonology. If I go to the Sims, then it's really low. And then if I come over here, they're actually showing up. So what gives? What's the problem? Let's first of all talk about the obvious problem, which is PI. Amazingly, and this is where you'll have to forgive me for living in a bubble, there are quite a lot of people who don't know what PI is. PI is Power Infusion, is what is given by priests. Currently, logs are kind of a scam, unfortunately to be said. This is no disrespect for anybody who has top rank logs right now, but a hell of a lot of them, people who are playing this fully understand what I'm talking about, are a bit of a scam. And what's happening, in fact, China has a guild which is literally naming their logs after the person who is getting PI on every single fight this week. So PI is a significant buff in many, many ways for a class. It is given by a priest. It's often a point of controversy as a lot of Shadow Priests feel pigeonholed into giving it to other players who mathematically benefit more from it. It's one of the horrors that Shadow Priests are dealing with right now, is people trying to push it onto other people, where obviously it's a DPS cooldown. It's their DPS cooldown, and they would like to use it on themselves, obviously. Same problem that we had all the way back with Dark Intent that the Warlocks used to give out. But what we're seeing is a lot of people are giving players the chance to just go mad. Why? Because it's fun. It's not all about cheesing logs. It's a lot about having fun. And what you'll see if you actually delve into these logs just a little bit, it doesn't take more than a cursory glance to see this stuff, is that you'll find some of these players are getting something ridiculous, like 6 power infusions throughout the fight, which means at least 3 priests are giving them power infusion, right? So there are 3 players buffing them in order to get these kind of logs. Now, not everybody is doing that. Again, pinch of salt. Not everybody's doing that. Some classes are not having that benefit. Some classes are just naturally doing very, very well. So you have to be careful. If you're somebody who's like, oh, okay, I'm going to look at the logs, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at who is blasting, and I'm going to go with that. That makes a lot of sense to me. Now, on the face of it, that does make a lot of sense. However, a lot of, you need to bear in mind, you need to click into these things and have a look. It's like, wait a minute. Does this represent accurately what this class is capable of? Or is this a class that is being heavily supported by some other things? Because that's going to skew it all the more. And you might say, what's the solution to that, Mike? Look at the representation at the top end, right? Look at how many of them are. Because not everybody's doing this, okay? Absolutely not everybody is doing this. But you look at it. If you see there are a lot of... If we look at, say, the Hungering Destroyer, there are a huge amount of Affliction logs. There are a huge amount of Fire Mages. There are a huge amount. If you look at it basically on an odds-on sample, yeah, those classes are doing very, very well. What about something like Demonology Warlock then? How is it that this sims is the lowest, Mike? And I love Demonology, but I'm seeing there's logs here of like a Demonology Warlock doing nearly like 6.5k DPS, right? Even though it sims at 5.7 in BIS gear. So, did the sims wrong, or what's going on? Well, here's where some more funny business goes on, because the way Blizzard redesigned the Demonology Warlock and made it so that their most powerful cooldown, the Tyrant, was affected by HP. And what you'll see if you go into these logs, again, is players working the system. And players are extraordinary at that. In fact, most of the class problems you've ever heard of in the past have come from players finding some way of gaming the system in their favor. Now, using Power Infusion is not gaming the system by any means. That's just using a cooldown available to the raid. But looking at exactly how a class or spec is designed, and then saying, oh, actually, if I just boost my HP, actually I get a significant damage buff from that because of the way my class is designed. And then you go into those logs and you see that those Demonology Warlocks are using things like PvP trinkets that boost their HP by a significant amount in order to get those results. And they're also using Power Infusion. Okay? So this is another way you need to sort of understand how these things are happening, instead of looking at the face of it and just going, oh, well, if this is A and this is B, then that should just go straight over. That's not really the case either, and it gets very tricky. Now, what we are seeing is scaling issues. So this is where we can get some good information, because all I've done for the last sort of 10 minutes is tell you like how to spot potential problems, but also give you hopefully a good basis for being able to check these things yourself. If you are like hoping and praying, say if you are a Feral Druid right now, you're probably looking at Feral simming extremely high, and then you're seeing a couple of logs where Feral Druids are popping up, and you're thinking, okay, so next tier should be the rise of the Feral Druid. Very much maybe. As we've seen with what happened recently with the Windwalker, is there is always a spot, even in the very, very highest of Mythic raiding, where there is that ability to throw in that sort of generally considered off-meta spec or class, especially if it plays into other strengths. So one of the things the Windwalker had going for it, not only was it extraordinarily good DPS early days, but it also freed the tanks up to not, or freed raids up to not being a Brewmaster, especially as Mistweavers weren't considered super useful, although they're pretty, they're fine, they're absolutely fine, but as we've come to realize recently, saying something's fine doesn't actually matter to a lot of people. They want to know what's best. But Windwalkers are, Mistweavers are absolutely fine, but they're not getting the representation in the high end and on the screens and on the streams that you would like to see if you were playing one. So what that allowed, bringing a Windwalker also allowed the tanks to play things that were also considered traditionally off meta, like Vengeance Demon Hunter, right? Vengeance Demon Hunter has been something that has been clawing at the bit in order to get representation in the raiding, and as several tiers we have pointed out that this is, and I consider it easily the most fun tank to play, but it just wasn't getting that representation. It wasn't getting seen. Bringing a Brewmaster, bringing a Blood DK was just a better choice. And therefore, we don't need the Windwalker debuffs, these raid debuffs that carry so many classes into the raid. But we do have that spot. Now, Feral or something doesn't have that going for it, but as we've seen several times now, and I think this is something you guys should all bear in mind, is as my guild stopped raiding and people applied to many, many guilds across the top 100, one of the other meta shifts we are seeing is actually in the thought process behind raids. So after my guild died, I had a long conversation with my raid leader, Alex, as to what led to the guild dying and his thoughts and how he was feeling at the time and what would happen if they ever decided to raid again. And he considered, before we even get into this subject, he considered that one of the biggest failings that he didn't enjoy about running our guild was the forced use of alts. Now, I found that really interesting because the use of alts has been sort of mandatory in high-end raiding since the Burning Crusade. Ever since Blizzard started introducing, especially in Wrath of the Lich King, ever since Blizzard started to mess around and fidget with how the raids were done, so we had things like timed efforts, limited attempts, gated content, all that kind of stuff made alts mandatory because you had to sort of do the bosses on alts so you wouldn't waste tries on your mains and ensure it died. And since then, having alt characters has been a staple of the high-end raiding scene, and a lot of people are put off by that, which I think this is why this conversation is worthwhile right now, is there are so many players who are off-put by getting into the high-end raiding scene because it doubles the amount of work you have to do. So if you base it off things like Legion, AP farm, not only do you maybe already hate the fact that you had to grind your artifact weapon for ever-decreasing returns, you had to double that. If we look at BFA, one of the big hatreds I had of BFA, although I didn't make a big fuss out of it in my videos because it affects so few people, was that, yes, I had to do every single world quest twice every day, right? In the early days, that was something I had to do. When it came to the Najatar farm and the Mechagon farm, I had to do that twice in order to get those characters ready and ready to raid, because having an alt available, certainly something that could step in, was a big deal. Now, as my guild has been applying to different guilds across the top 100, more and more, and Alex agrees with this, those guilds are abandoning that thought process because realistically, we're not using those alts. And that's a big thing. We have at least 25 players grinding multiple characters up, yet we're only using their main character. In the vast, vast, vast majority of cases, we're not swapping characters in and out. You combine that with Shadowlands' limited loot availability, and whichever character is getting mythic quality items, which makes a significant difference to a player's power, is just overwhelmingly better than an alt. And the only instance where an alt can be interesting is if it's something scam. So, for an example of that would be something like N'Zoth, where suddenly Blizzard throws a mechanic at you where you need sort of 7 to 8 immunity classes in the raid. You might not have that accounted for. However, a lot of these top guilds, certainly your Limits and Echoes of the world, are clearing that content and finding out those problems so fast that even if you're in the world 40th, you have more than enough time to prepare for that problem and get a character ready. And always, there are people who play alts anyway because they enjoy it. But enforcing it is not a particularly big deal. So, that means people have become more and more free, and seemingly this is something that will spread throughout the player base, more and more free to pick the character they enjoy, making them naturally better at it, and go with that. Because that seems to be paying off in spades for a lot of top-end guilds, is they just say, what do you enjoy playing? Okay, go with that. Now, within reason of that spec not being absolutely garbage, you should be totally fine. What does that mean then? What we're seeing is that combination of people being able to decide on something and stick with it. And we're also now starting to see the effects of scaling, bringing those classes back in. So at the beginning of the video, I talked about, say, rogues as a meme, where this nobody could have predicted, and this is why the 9.1 information is so important to us. No one could have predicted, say, rogues wouldn't have been a big part of the meta, because they always are. It's one of those things you could probably gamble on and win 9 times out of 10. You just would have lost this time. But now scaling's kicking in as well, guys. So what that means is the classes that were naturally very good without good gear Marksman Hunter would be the primary function of that. I think that's the best example I played. I didn't choose it because of that, but it just turned out to be that way. Is that it didn't... My gear made my damage better, but the way the spec worked and its base level damage was really, really good. And it played into the strengths of what the raid provided. So this is where the simcraft and the reality starts to separate as well. Because a lot of the sims are done single target. They try hectic cleave and things like that. But until you get into the fight and you say like, oh, okay, well, Stone Legion Generals, for example, absolutely requires that we do massive burst AoE. That plays directly into the strengths of that character. So what you might have is, say, in a different world, Beast Mastery is the best. You know, but then everybody's playing marksman over here. Gahoon would be a good example of this, where suddenly fire mages were fantastic, whereas nobody would play fire up until that point. We were playing Frost and Arcane, and then suddenly you get to Gahoon, and it's like, well, actually, this fight plays into our strengths, because there's tons and tons of movement, there's tons of low health adds, which guarantees critical strikes, and we have this on-demand burst with combustion. That plays perfectly into the strengths of how that class is designed, no matter what the sims say. So that gives us another opportunity as well. Now, the problem is with these scaling things, is these classes that are naturally good at the start, once gear starts coming into it, what you find is that in many cases, these classes that are quote-unquote not good at the very start of progression, once they start adding more and more gear to them, they overcome their base flaws, right? And we're starting to see that with things like the Rogue. We're starting to see the Outlaw Rogues showing a greater representation week on week on week, is that these Rogues are rising up. What we are also starting to see is the drop down of the specs that were also really good, because they're starting to get outscaled as more gear comes into the game by these other classes that have a higher potential DPS ceiling once they can actually fly. Once they have certain amounts of haste, certain amounts of spell power, certain amounts of mastery and crit, they start to roll with each other. And they start to dip heavier into their secondary stats. They're more reliant on their secondary stats than some other classes are. So we are starting to see the fall of the Marksmanship Hunter, and the rise of the Shadow Priest, right? It's starting to flip positions on those things, which are traditionally bad classes. And it's a good thing, because it shows that when Blizzard does its balancing, and some people get very frustrated by this, especially if you look at, say, a Fury Warrior that's had like 9 buffs or whatever, is you start to question, what's Blizzard thinking? And they have data way in advance of us, which means that they can go, yeah, right now it's pretty weak, but once this gets some gear and we see what it's capable of, it's actually going to start flying. And if we overbuff it early, that's going to be a big problem. So, what information can we take away from that? If you're a rogue right now, are you supposed to abandon that and just leave it for dead? I would say absolutely not. I think it's an anomaly. Personally, I think it's an anomaly that the rogue was left out of this tier. It just didn't bring anything else mechanically to it, especially compared to the Unholy DKs. Now, Unholy DKs may potentially be a problem. They are extremely good, and they scale extremely well, and they also bring Anti-Magic Zone, which is far and away better than anything, say, a Rogue is bringing, or a Windwalker is bringing. They're bringing this stuff. The same with the Demon Hunter. Now, I do think Demon Hunters are going to rise. There are a lot of guilds right now. If you guys go check out Wild Progress, those Demon Hunters of you out there who are like, what's happening? We're supposed to be good. You'll notice a lot of guilds are starting to recruit and gear their Demon Hunters, because these guys already know the process I'm explaining to you now. They look at the data, and they look at, say, the sim of a Havoc Demon Hunter and say, wow, that's like third from the bottom, man. So what's happening there? They're pretty aware that Blizzard likes Demon Hunters. They're pretty aware that as they get more stuff, they're likely to get better. They start scaling up quite nicely. We're not seeing that represented in the logs right now, but your gut feeling, and this is the gut feeling I'm transferring to you right now, is that Havoc's probably going to be pretty good next tier. Can't guarantee it. Can never guarantee anything. But there's a high chance Blizzard does want Havoc Demon Hunters to have a spot, because they're like their little golden boy class. They really like them. Now, that might involve the nerfing of some other things, for sure. I am desperately worried about what's going to happen with Unholy DKs and AMZ. It has been abused to the absolute death in Castle Nathria, and I kind of suspect Blizzard may come in strong on that. I hope they don't. I play one. I really enjoy it. AMZ is cool and all, but it's actually the gameplay I enjoy, so I really hope they don't hammer him into the ground. That would be great. And I would also encourage some of you who are worried about your spec or thinking about abandoning your spec entirely, or in some severe cases, which I've heard from many of you, is actually stop playing the game until your spec is ready, is to pay close attention. Because what we're seeing is, this is why we tie all these things together. What we're seeing is, in the Sims, a lot of classes are rising which were previously thought garbage. That is happening. That's good news. We're also seeing on the logs that the shift is happening, where more and more classes are getting more representation than before. What we're also seeing, which I think is really good for everybody, is if you start accounting for the top 400 logs of several bosses, we're starting to see a really small divide between each position. That means that DPS across a multitude of specs is actually very, very close. That's a good thing. That means that you're not being severely punished. We're starting to see a good mix. Basically what I'm saying here, guys, is we're seeing the Legion effect. And that Legion effect is that if Blizzard doesn't have to completely remake the game, which they do not have to do in the Shadowlands, is that they allow the classes to catch up to each other and start equalizing. And if you recall, Legion was the most balanced the game ever was. And I know some people go, shut up! It was. It absolutely was. And it's starting to happen again here. Let's hope they can keep it up. Some specs obviously need some love. No one's denying that whatsoever. But for anyone out there panicking, or more importantly, trying to plan for the next tier so that they have a better time, watch this space. Don't do anything dramatic right now. And pay attention to all the things we talked about in this video, because there's plenty of information out there. Thank you so much for listening, guys. And I'll see you again. Bye-bye.